Through dust-streaked windows of the Copper Rose Saloon, late afternoon light filters across worn pine floorboards, casting amber shadows on a solitary figure. A woman in a simple brown riding dress sits quietly at a corner table, her delicate fingers wrapped around a cup of tea. Her face, partially hidden beneath a modest bonnet, betrays nothing of note. And that's exactly how Kate Mitchell prefers it these days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Copper Gulch wasn't much of a town anymore. What had once been a promising copper mining settlement had withered into little more than a scatter of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of the Sonoran Desert. The copper veins had run dry nearly a decade ago, taking with them the dreams of fortune seekers and leaving behind only those too stubborn or too rooted to leave. But for Kate Mitchell, it was perfect. No one here knew about Desert Rose, the bounty hunter whose wanted posters were still whispered about in saloons across 3 territories. No one remembered the woman who'd brought in the notorious Clayton Brothers, dead or alive, or the shadow that had haunted the Vasquez gang until every last member hung from territorial gallows. Here, she was just Miss Mitchell, the quiet seamstress who kept to herself and occasionally helped Mrs. Henderson teach Sunday school. 8 years of peace had softened her appearance, if not her instincts. Her once dark hair now showed threads of silver at the temples, partially hidden beneath modest bonnets. The calluses on her hands, built from years of handling rope and rifle, were attributed to her skill with needle and thread. The sharp eyes that had tracked men across hundreds of miles of desert were now seen as nothing more than a seamstress's attention to detail. The legendary Winchester that had earned her the nickname Desert Rose now rested in a sealed compartment beneath her bedroom floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth alongside wanted posters and newspaper clippings from another life. Her hands, though marked by time, still maintained their strength and steadiness, a fact she kept to herself, just like the daily shooting practice she maintained in the privacy of her small ranch outside town. The regulars at the Copper Rose had learned to let her be with her thoughts and her tea. Even Jasper Collins, the town gossip who'd talk the ear off a fence post, knew better than to disturb Miss Mitchell during her afternoon ritual. There was something in the way she carried herself, something in her gaze that hinted at depths best left unplumbed. "More tea, Miss Mitchell?" Clara Warren's voice cut through her reverie. The saloon owner's daughter, barely 18, had a gentle smile that reminded Kate of her own sister, long dead in a raid that had set her on the path of the bounty hunter. Clara was one of the few bright spots in Copper Gulch, managing the saloon while her mother slowly succumbed to consumption in the rooms above. "Much obliged, Clara," she nodded, sliding her empty cup across the worn table. She'd watched Clara grow from a pigtailed child into a capable young woman, and sometimes caught herself wondering if her own life might have been different if violence hadn't claimed her family so early. The familiar routine of afternoon quiet was suddenly interrupted by the crunch of hooves and loud voices from the street. Through the window, Kate watched as 4 riders pulled up outside. Their horses were quality stock, too fine for common drifters, and their clothes, though trail-worn, spoke of money. The way they carried themselves, all swagger and barely contained violence, told her everything she needed to know. The leader's coat was stained with the red dust of the Sonoran Desert, but the matched pair of Colts at his hips gleamed with recent care. Trouble had finally found Copper Gulch. The batwing doors swung open with a protesting creak, bringing with them a gust of hot desert air and the smell of dust and leather. The 4 men swaggered in, spurs ringing against the wooden floor. The leader, a tall man with a face marked by smallpox scars and eyes the color of gunmetal, surveyed the near-empty room with calculated deliberation. Kate recognized the look. She'd seen it in her own reflection countless times during her hunting days. These weren't common bandits. These were killers who'd found a quiet town far from the law. In her corner, Catherine Mitchell sat motionless, her hands relaxed in her lap, watching through lowered lashes as another chapter in her carefully constructed piece prepared to unfold. The question wasn't whether there would be violence. Men like these carried it with them like a disease. The question was how long she could maintain her cover before the past came calling with lead and gunpowder. The afternoon sun continued its slow arc toward the horizon, and in the corner, An old Seth Thomas clock ticked away the seconds, counting down to a moment Catherine Mitchell had prayed would never come again. "Well, ain't this a sorry excuse for a saloon?" the pockmarked leader drawled, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone used to being obeyed. "Where's the owner?" Clara stepped forward, her chin held high despite the tremor Kate could detect in her hands. "My mother's indisposed. I'm managing things until she's well." "That so?" The leader's lips curled into an unpleasant smile. "Pretty little thing like you running a place like this? Ain't that just interesting?" His companions spread out across the room with practiced efficiency, like coyotes circling wounded prey. Kate watched them carefully, noting how their gun belts rode low and worn, the mark of men who use them often. The leader's hands bore the telltale calluses of a gunman, and the way his eyes constantly scanned the room spoke of experience earned through violence. "We'll need rooms," the leader continued, leaning against the bar, "and information. Word is an old friend of ours passed through here a while back, fellow named Reeves. Ring any bells?" Clara shook her head, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any rooms available at present, and I don't know anyone by that name." The leader's smile vanished like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Now that's not very hospitable. Maybe we ain't making ourselves clear enough." His hand drifted closer to his gun. When the Bishop brothers ask for something, smart folks tend to be real accommodating. Kate felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The Bishop brothers, she knew the name. 2 years ago, they'd cut a bloody swath through Arizona territory, robbing banks and leaving dead lawmen in their wake. She'd read about them in the newspaper, grateful those days were behind her. But now, here they were, bringing their particular brand of violence to her quiet corner of the world. The youngest Bishop brother, barely out of his teens with a face unmarked by sun or conscience, knocked over a chair deliberately, testing for reaction. The sound echoed through the saloon like a gunshot, making Clara jump. Old Jim Tucker had already slipped out the back door, his half-finished whiskey still sweating rings onto the bar top. The aging prospector might not have much sense left, but he could still smell trouble brewing. Now it was just Kate, Clara, and the 4 Bishop brothers in the growing tension of the afternoon heat. "You know what I think?" The pockmarked leader, Wade Bishop himself, pushed away from the bar, spurs jangling with each deliberate step. His duster swept behind him like a shroud, and Kate noted how his right hand never strayed far from his holster. "I think maybe this town's been lying to itself, thinking it's too small, too quiet for anybody to notice. But everything's got value, doesn't it? Even a dried-up mining town like this one." The second youngest brother, a weasel-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth, laughed. "Ain't that the truth, Wade? Even got themselves a proper lady seamstress." He leered at Kate, who kept her eyes downcast, though every muscle in her body had coiled like a spring. Kate felt something stirring in her chest, something she'd buried 8 years ago along with her Winchester and her reputation. She recognized the feeling. It was the same cold clarity that used to settle over her before a hunt, when the world would narrow down to tracks and trajectories, when every movement became a calculation of distance against time. Her fingers, resting in her lap, began to tap a slow rhythm, an old tell she thought she'd conquered. In her mind's eye, she could see her Winchester, wrapped in that oiled cloth, lying beneath the floorboards just 10 minutes' walk from here. 10 minutes might as well be 10 years if things went bad now. Wade Bishop continued, reaching the middle of the room. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, boards that had seen their share of blood and broken men over the years. "About those rooms, I'm thinking you might want to reconsider your position, miss. We're planning to stay a while, get to know the locals." His hand settled on his gun belt, thumb hooking over the elaborately tooled leather. "Make some friends." Clara's voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground. Kate had seen that same steel in her mother's eyes years ago, before the consumption had taken hold. "As I said, we have no rooms available. The mining company representatives took them all last week." It was a lie. The mining company hadn't sent anyone in months, but Kate had to admire the girl's quick thinking. Mining company? The weasel-faced brother snorted, spitting tobacco juice onto the floor. In this ghost town? Ain't been nothing worth digging up here since before the war. Consolidated copper, Clara continued, warming to her story. Her hands were steady now as she wiped down the bar, a picture of casual confidence that only someone like Kate, who'd spent years reading people's tells, would know was forced. They're investigating reopening the deep vein mine. There's been talk of new deposits discovered lower than the old-timers could reach. Kate noticed how Wade's eyes narrowed at this information. A ghost of a smile played across his pockmarked face, pulling at the edges of his scars. Is that so? Well, ain't that interesting news? He turned to his brothers. Boys, I'm thinking Copper Gulch might be more entertaining than we expected. The third youngest brother, a red-headed man with a face like a ferret, moved closer to Clara, his spurs marking each step with a predatory jingle. Maybe we ought to introduce ourselves proper to these fine mining gentlemen when they return. Wouldn't want them thinking we're unfriendly. Kate could read their intentions as clearly as a wanted poster. They'd wait for the supposed mining men to return, ambush them, take whatever they were carrying. When no mining men showed up, they'd turn their frustrations on the town. She'd seen it happen before, back in her other life. Sometimes she'd been the one to stop it, tracking the perpetrators across desert and mountain until justice was served. Sometimes she'd arrive too late, finding only cooling bodies and grieving families. The pattern was as familiar as an old song. First comes the threat, then the waiting, then the violence. Always the violence. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting bars of light across the floor like prison shadows. In one of those bars, Kate caught sight of her own shadow, stretched long and thin. For a moment, it looked like the shadow she used to cast back when her Winchester rode close, and men spoke her name in whispers. Back when being the Desert Rose meant something more than just a story told around campfires. Wade Bishop had finally noticed her sitting quietly in her corner, the pockmarked gunman's eyes cold and calculating. You're awful interested in our conversation over there, ma'am. Kate kept her voice mild, her posture demure, years of practice having taught her how to look harmless, how to be the quiet seamstress everyone overlooked. Just enjoying my tea is all. Tea? The youngest brother laughed, the sound sharp and mean as a cactus thorn. In a saloon? What kind of woman drinks tea in a saloon? A proper one, Kate replied, maintaining eye contact with Wade. She saw something flicker in the gunman's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or just the instinct that comes from years of sizing up potential threats. It was the look of a wolf catching an unfamiliar scent on the wind. Wade stepped closer, his spurs marking each step with a silver note. The other patrons had cleared out by now, leaving the saloon feeling bigger and emptier than before. You got a name, ma'am? Catherine Mitchell. Mitchell. Wade rolled the name around his mouth like a sip of whiskey. Don't recall hearing that name before. Have you been in Copper Gulch long? Long enough. The weasel-faced brother had edged away from Clara now, attention drawn by the quiet tension building between his older brother and the woman in the corner. Kate could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one wrong move, and 8 years of peace would shatter like a mirror under a bullet. You know what I think? Wade's hand drifted closer to his gun, fingers flexing like a pianist before a performance. I think maybe you ought to find somewhere else to enjoy your tea. Streets are going to get mighty dangerous around here, and it would be a shame if anything happened to a proper lady like yourself. Kate felt time slow down, felt the weight of the moment pressing against her like a strong desert wind. She had a choice to make. She could walk away, head home, dig out her Winchester, and prepare for what was coming. The smart play, the careful play, the play that might save her life but cost her something more precious, the ability to look herself in the mirror tomorrow morning. Or she could end this now, before it began, before anyone else got hurt, before Clara had to learn the hard lessons she'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. Her hands remained still in her lap, but in her mind they were already moving, already feeling the familiar weight of her rifle. 8 years was a long time, but some things you never forget. Some skills stay in your bones. waiting for the moment they're needed again, like a language you learned as a child or the memory of your first kill's face. The Seth Thomas clock ticked in the corner, marking seconds that stretched like years. Kate looked at Clara, saw the fear in her eyes, and made her decision. Whatever came next would change everything. But then that's what decisions were for. "Maybe," she said softly, each word carrying the weight of a bullet. "It's not my safety you should be worried about." Wade Bishop's smile froze on his pockmarked face, then slowly melted away like snow in desert sun. The gunman took another step forward, boot heels striking the floorboards with deliberate force. Behind him, his brothers spread out instinctively, falling into a triangle formation that spoke of years of practice. The youngest shifted left while the ferret-faced man drifted right, their movements as natural as wolves circling prey. "That almost sounded like a threat, ma'am." Wade's voice had dropped an octave, carrying the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. "Surely a proper lady like yourself wouldn't be threatening anybody, not in a nice quiet town like this." Kate hadn't moved from her chair, hadn't so much as lifted her teacup, but something had changed in the way she held herself. A subtle shift that Clara noticed from behind the bar. The demure posture had vanished, replaced by the kind of stillness that comes only from complete control. Her eyes, usually soft and polite, had taken on a harder cast, like desert stones polished by years of dangerous winds. "Just making an observation," Kate replied, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room, bouncing off the tin ceiling tiles that had witnessed countless confrontations over the years. About safety, about choices, about how some men don't know when they're pushing their luck, about how some decisions can't be unmade. The youngest Bishop brother laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it now, like a man testing ice he's not sure will hold his weight. "Listen to this woman, Wade, talking like she's somebody, like she's got any say in what happens here." "Somebody." Kate's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it never reached her eyes. "No, I'm nobody special, just a woman who's lived long enough to recognize trouble when it walks through the door." She paused, letting her gaze drift to each brother in turn, noting how the redhead's trigger finger twitched against his holster, how the youngest kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, and long enough to know what happens next if that trouble doesn't walk right back out. Clara watched the exchange with growing tension, her hands gripping the edge of the bar until her knuckles whitened. She'd known Catherine Mitchell for 5 years, seen her sew dresses with hands that never seemed to shake, teach Sunday school with endless patience, help repair the church roof after the big storm last winter. But she'd never heard her speak like this, never seen this steel-spined stranger wearing her friend's familiar face. It was like watching a mask slip, revealing something dangerous underneath. Wade's hand had drifted closer to his gun, fingers flexing like a card sharp before the deal. A bead of sweat traced one of his pockmarks despite the cooling air. "You know what I think, Miss Mitchell? I think maybe you've been out in the sun too long, making you say things you might regret, things that might have consequences." "The sun's been good to me," Kate replied, her voice carrying the kind of patience that comes from long practice. "Shows me things clear as day, like how your gun belt's worn more on the right side means you favor your hip shot, or how your youngest brother there can't seem to keep his gun hand still, sign of a man who's eager but ain't quite sure of himself yet, or how the redhead keeps looking at you before he moves, means he's quick but he doesn't trust his own judgment." The red-headed brother's eyes widened slightly, hand jerking away from his gun like it had suddenly grown hot. "Wade, I don't like—" "Quiet!" Wade cut him off, his voice sharp as a razor. His gunmetal eyes hadn't left Kate, studying her with the intensity of a man trying to recall something just out of reach. "You seem to know an awful lot about gunfighting for a proper lady, Miss Mitchell. More than most learn just from watching. You'd be surprised what you learn watching people come and go through a town like this." Kate's fingers had stopped their drumming, settling into an unnatural stillness that seemed to draw all eyes in the room. 8 years I've sat in this corner, seen all kinds pass through, some looking for trouble, some running from it. Some think they're the fastest guns around, right up until they meet somebody faster. Sometimes they learn from the meeting. Sometimes they don't learn anything ever again. A whisper of memory stirred in Wade's eyes. 8 years, he repeated slowly, testing each syllable like a man searching for poison in his food. That would be right around the time Desert Rose disappeared, right after that business in Yuma with the Martinez family. Clara's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Everyone in the territory had heard of Desert Rose, the legendary bounty hunter who'd vanished without a trace after the bloody showdown in Yuma. Some said she'd been killed, others that she'd grown tired of the killing and walked away. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing: she'd been the deadliest shot anyone had ever seen. Desert Rose is just a story now, Kate said quietly, her words falling into the silence like stones into a deep well. Like most things from those days, just tales people tell around campfires to scare their children straight. Maybe Wade's pockmarked face had taken on a predatory intensity, like a hunting cat that's caught an interesting scent. Or maybe she just got tired, started drinking tea instead of whiskey, found herself a quiet corner in a quiet town. His hand settled on his gun belt, thumb hooking over the tooled leather. Would be quite a thing, wouldn't it? Finding out Desert Rose has been hiding right here in Copper Gulch all this time. Kate's next words carried across the room like smoke over still water. Might be an even bigger thing finding out why she chose to disappear in the first place. Why might a woman walk away from a reputation like that, only to surface again when 4 brothers ride into town looking for trouble? The youngest Bishop brother's hand had drifted to his gun now, but there was sweat visible on his forehead despite the cooling air. The redhead had backed up another step, his ferret-like face darting between his older brother and the seated figure, trying to calculate odds that suddenly seemed less certain. "Could be we're about to find out," Wade said, his voice soft but carrying an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Unless you're planning to handle this with just words, ma'am." "Words can be enough," Kate replied, "if a person's smart enough to hear what they're really saying." She lifted her teacup, took a slow sip, set it down with deliberate care. Each movement was measured, precise, like someone who'd never needed to hurry because waiting was part of their strength. "Question is, are you that smart, Mr. Bishop?" The Seth Thomas clock ticked away the seconds, each sound like a hammer falling on steel. Through the windows, the sun had sunk lower, painting the saloon in shades of amber and shadow. In those shadows, murder waited with practiced patience, balanced on the knife edge between warning and war. Clara watched it all, her heart hammering against her ribs, seeing her quiet town balanced on the precipice of violence, and in the middle of it all sat Catherine Mitchell, still as death itself, her eyes carrying the weight of 8 years of secrets about to come undone. The saloon doors creaked open, drawing every eye except Kate's. Sheriff Tom Randall stood framed in the doorway, his badge catching the late afternoon light. He was a young man, barely 30, who'd taken the job because nobody else wanted it. His gun belt was new, the leather still stiff, and his stance spoke more of uncertainty than authority. "Everything all right in here?" Randall's hand rested nervously on his holster, eyes darting between the Bishop brothers and Kate. Old Jim came running into my office talking about trouble. "No trouble, Sheriff." Wade straightened slowly, though his eyes never left Kate. "Just having a friendly conversation with Miss Mitchell here about the old days. Ain't that right?" "The old days," Kate repeated softly. "They have a way of catching up to a person, don't they, Sheriff? Like unpaid debts." Randall shifted uncomfortably, aware he'd stepped into something he didn't fully understand. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and he could feel the weight of years' worth of history pressing down on the moment. "Miss Mitchell's been telling us some interesting stories," the youngest Bishop brother said, trying to inject lightness into his voice but failing. "About Desert Rose. Have you ever heard those stories, Sheriff?" Randall's face paled slightly. Like everyone else in the territory, he knew the tales. "Those are old stories, best left in the past where they belong." "The past," Wade mused, his pockmarked face thoughtful. "Funny thing about the past. Sometimes it's sitting right in front of you, drinking tea in a saloon corner." He turned to Randall, his voice taking on an official tone. "Tell me, Sheriff, how long has Miss Mitchell here been in your town?" 8 years, Clara answered from behind the bar, her voice steady despite her fear. "Since before I was born. She's a good woman, never caused any trouble." 8 years, Wade repeated, savoring the words. "And in all that time, has anyone ever seen her shoot? Ever seen her handle a rifle? Ever wondered why a woman who knows so much about gunfighting chooses to live such a peaceful life?" Randall's eyes narrowed, really looking at Kate for perhaps the first time since taking office. The woman hadn't moved from her chair, hadn't changed her demure posture, but something was different. The sheriff had seen his share of dangerous people in his short career, learned to recognize the signs. Now, looking at Catherine Mitchell, he saw what he'd been missing all these years. "Miss Mitchell," Randall said carefully, "maybe you ought to come down to my office, for your own protection." A ghost of a smile touched Kate's lips. "Appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I reckon I'll stay right here. Sometimes a person has to face what's coming, even if they'd rather not." "Face what's coming." The weasel-faced brother's voice cracked slightly. "Wade, maybe we ought to—" "Quiet," Wade snapped, his face hardening. "Miss Mitchell here's been suggesting we leave town, says it ain't safe for us to stay." His hand hadn't moved from his gun belt. "But I'm thinking maybe it ain't safe for her. Woman her age, living with secrets like that. Might be time those secrets came to light." Clara stepped out from behind the bar, her mother's stubborn courage showing in her stance. "Leave her alone. Whatever you think you know, whatever you're planning, just leave her be." "Brave girl," Wade said without looking at her. "But this ain't about you. This is about legend and truth. About whether Desert Rose really died in Yuma, or if she just got tired. About whether a person can really change their nature or if it just goes to sleep for a while waiting to wake up." Kate's voice cut through the tension like a well-honed blade. "You seem awful interested in Desert Rose, Mr. Bishop. Any particular reason?" Something dark flickered across Wade's pockmarked face. "Maybe I knew some of the people she hunted. Maybe I've spent years wondering about the woman who put this mark on my face back when I was just starting out." He gestured to a particularly deep pockmark near his jaw. "The woman who shot my gun clean out of my hand and left me alive, but made sure I'd never draw quite as fast again." Understanding dawned in Kate's eyes. "The boy from the Martinez family. I remember now. You were riding with them when they took those hostages in Yuma. Weren't much more than a kid." "Just 17, Wade agreed, his voice tight with old pain. "You shot my gun hand, sent the bullet right through the webbing between thumb and forefinger. Ruined my draw forever. But you let me live. Let me watch as you hunted down my brothers one by one." Sheriff Randall's hand tightened on his gun. "Now hold on. Stay out of this, Sheriff," Wade warned, never taking his eyes off Kate. "This is between me and her. 8 years I've been looking. 8 years of hearing stories, following rumors, always a step behind. And here you are, hiding in plain sight, drinking tea in a 2-bit saloon." The Seth Thomas clock struck the hour, each chime falling into the silence like stones into a deep well. Outside, the sun had sunk lower, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. A warm breeze stirred the dust in the street, carrying with it the promise of violence as old as the territory itself. Kate set her teacup down for what might be the last time. 8 years is a long time to carry a grudge, boy. Long enough to learn better. "Long enough to get good with my offhand," Wade replied softly. "Long enough to make sure when I found you, it'd end differently this time." The saloon had grown darker as the sun continued its descent, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Sheriff Randall stood frozen between duty and wisdom, his new badge suddenly feeling as heavy as a gravestone on his chest. Clara had backed away from the bar, her hands pressed against her mouth, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare made real. "Offhand," Kate mused, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes just before a lightning strike. "That's why I didn't recognize your stance earlier. You've adapted, changed your style." There was almost a note of approval in her voice. the hunter's appreciation for technique rising above personal feelings. Wade's pockmarked face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. Had to after what you did. Had to learn everything all over again. Different grip, different draw, different way of thinking about the shot. His left hand hovered near his gun, fingers spread like a pianist about to strike a deadly chord. Spent years practicing, thousands of hours until I could do this. The movement was so fast it seemed to blur the air. Wade's left hand whipped down and up again, his gun appearing as if by magic, aimed steady at Kate's chest. The younger brothers let out low whistles of appreciation, but Kate hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. Fast, the former bounty hunter acknowledged. Smooth transition from the draw to the aim. Faster than you now, old woman, Wade said, but there was a question in his voice, a hint of uncertainty that his brothers might have missed, but Kate caught clearly. Had to be. Had to know that when I found you, I'd be ready. Sheriff Randall's hand had drifted toward his own gun, but Kate stopped him with a light shake of her head. Best stay out of this, Sheriff. Man's got a right to settle his debts. Debts? Wade's voice cracked like a whip. Is that what you call it? You killed my brothers, destroyed my gun hand, left me with this reminder. He gestured to his pockmarked face with his free hand. All because we were trying to make our way in the world. Kate's eyes hardened for the first time. Your way. You and your brothers took hostages in Yuma, women and children, shot the bank guard, a man of 60, because he wasn't moving fast enough, then started firing into the crowd when the marshal showed up. That's the way you were making in the world. The youngest Bishop brother shifted uncomfortably. Wade, you never said, shut up. Wade's gun hand trembled slightly before steadying. You don't get to judge me, old woman. Not after what you did, not after hiding out here pretending to be something you're not. Desert Rose, the famous bounty hunter with a conscience. The woman who only hunted bad men. He spat the words like poison. Tell me, how many men did you kill before you found your conscience? How many didn't deserve it? A shadow passed across Kate's face, brief but deep as a canyon. Too many, she admitted quietly. That's why I stopped, why I walked away. Some debts can't be paid with more killing. Clara's voice cut through the tension. Catherine, is it true? Were you really Desert Rose? Kate's eyes never left Wade's gun. Yes, though not for a long time now. Not since Yuma. Not since I realized what I was becoming. What you were becoming. Wade's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You were becoming a legend, the deadliest shot in the territory, the woman who could track a man across 100 miles of desert and never miss her mark. And you threw it away to become what? A seamstress? A Sunday school teacher? A proper lady drinking tea in a corner? I became what I chose to be, Kate replied, her voice carrying the weight of 8 years of certainty. Same as you chose what you became. The difference is, I chose to stop. The red-headed brother had backed all the way to the wall now, his ferret-like face darting between his older brother and the seated woman. The youngest had his hand on his gun but seemed unsure whether to draw it, aware that any sudden movement might spark an explosion. Well, your choice is about to catch up with you. Wade's left hand tightened on his gun. Get up, nice and slow. We're going to walk out into the street and we're going to finish what you started in Yuma. Woman to man. Unless you're too old and proper to handle a rifle anymore. Kate sat very still, 8 years of peace hanging in the balance. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried to every corner of the room. I buried my Winchester for a reason, Mr. Bishop. Buried it with the woman I used to be. Dig it up or I'll shoot you where you sit, Wade snarled. Your choice, old woman. Die like a coward or die like Desert Rose. The Seth Thomas clock ticked away the seconds, each sound like a nail being driven into Hope's coffin. Sheriff Randall looked desperately between the two, knowing he should do something but equally certain that any intervention would only make things worse. Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears, seeing her friend balance between the woman she'd chosen to be and the woman she'd once been. Finally, Kate nodded, the movement so slight it was barely perceptible. Clara, she said, her voice gentle as snow. "In my house under the floorboards near the window, there's an oiled cloth package. The key's on a leather string in the kitchen drawer. Would you fetch it for me?" Clara hesitated only a moment before nodding and hurrying toward the door. As she passed, Kate spoke again, her words carrying the weight of both apology and farewell. "I'm sorry you have to see this. Sorry to bring this violence to your door. But sometimes the past won't stay buried, no matter how deep you put it." The minutes stretched like years as they waited for Clara's return. Wade kept his gun trained steadily on Kate while his brothers maintained their positions, creating a triangle of threat around the seated woman. Outside, the street had grown quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Randall cleared his throat. "Maybe there's another way to settle this." "There isn't," Wade cut him off, never taking his eyes off Kate. "Been too many years, too many miles. Woman hunts your brothers, destroys your gun hand, leaves you with a face that makes children cry. That ain't the kind of debt that gets settled with words." Kate sat perfectly still, but her mind was racing through memories of another life. The weight of her Winchester against her shoulder, the smell of gun oil and wood, the way time seemed to slow down in those crucial moments before a shot. 8 years of peace had softened her appearance but hadn't dulled those memories. They were still sharp as razor wire in her mind. "Your brothers," Kate said quietly. "We're killing innocent people. That guard in Yuma wasn't their first victim. I'd been tracking the Martinez family for 2 months before that day. Found the bodies they left behind. Men, women, didn't seem to matter to them." Wade's pockmarked face twisted. "We were at war with the world, taking what we deserved? What did you deserve?" For the first time, real anger crept into Kate's voice. "That guard, Samuel Turner was his name. He had a family, 3 daughters he was putting through school, had dreams of them becoming teachers." Her eyes locked onto Wade's. "They were there that day, watched their father die because you were taking what you deserved." The youngest Bishop brother shifted uncomfortably. "Wade, you never told us, because it don't matter." Wade's voice cracked like a whip. "Past is past. What matters is here and now. What matters is Desert Rose thinking she could bury her sins under 8 years of playing proper." Quick footsteps on the wooden walkway outside announced Clara's return. She burst through the doors, clutching an oiled cloth package to her chest, her face flushed from running. "Set it down," Kate instructed gently. "Over here where I can reach it." Clara placed the package beside her chair, her hands trembling slightly. "Catherine, please, you don't have to do this." She smiled at her, a genuine smile that carried all the warmth of their years of friendship. "Some things a person has to do, Clara. Some debts need paying, one way or another." Her eyes moved to the package, though her hands remained still in her lap. "I suspect this payment has been coming due for a long time now." The package was simple, wrapped in well-oiled canvas that had protected it through 8 years of voluntary exile. Inside lay a Winchester rifle that seemed to draw all the light in the room to its dark wood and gleaming steel. "Well, well," Wade breathed, a hint of anticipation creeping into his voice. "The famous weapon itself. They said Desert Rose's rifle was custom-made by a gunsmith in St. Louis. Said the action was so smooth it barely made a sound when she worked it." Kate's hands hovered over the cloth-wrapped bundle. "His name was Martin Chen, lived outside St. Louis, spent his life making beautiful things until the Martinez family killed him and his wife for the silver in his workshop." Her eyes met Wade's. "Another debt that got paid in Yuma." The red-headed brother had gone pale. "Wade, maybe this ain't such a good idea. If she really is Desert Rose—" "Shut up!" Wade's gun hand had started to tremble slightly. "She's just an old woman now. Whatever she used to be, time catches up with everyone." Kate lifted the rifle from its resting place, the familiar weight settling into her hands like a long-lost friend. The cloth fell away, revealing dark wood, worn smooth from years of use, steel fittings gleaming dully in the fading light. Clara watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as her friend, the quiet woman who'd sewn her graduation dress, who'd taught her hymns at Sunday school, who'd always had a kind word and a gentle smile, transformed before her eyes. Just holding the Winchester seemed to change her, straightening her spine, squaring her shoulders, turning back the years like pages in a book. Her fingers moved over the weapon with the familiarity of an old love, checking the action, making sure 8 years of rest hadn't affected its reliability. "Last chance," Kate said softly, working the action with practiced ease. The sound seemed to fill the room like a prayer. "Walk away, Mr. Bishop. Take your brothers and ride out. Let the past stay buried." Wade's laugh was sharp and bitter as winter wind. "You know I can't do that. Not now, not after all these years." "No," Kate sighed, rising slowly from her chair, the Winchester held easily in her hands. "I don't suppose you can." Her movements were deliberate, unhurried as she stepped away from the table. "Sheriff, you'll want to clear the street. And Clara." She turned to her, eyes soft with regret. "You should go to your mother now. Some things aren't meant to be witnessed." The Seth Thomas clock ticked away the moment, each sound marking time's steady march toward violence. Outside, the sun had touched the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and shadow. Soon it would be dark, but not before old debts were paid in the currency of lead and gunpowder. Catherine Mitchell stood straight and tall, 8 years of peace falling away like autumn leaves in a storm. In her place stood Desert Rose, the legend that had never quite died, the ghost that had waited patiently beneath those floorboards for the day when it would be needed again. The street emptied like a river running backward, leaving nothing but dust devils dancing in the last rays of sunlight. Word had spread through Copper Gulch faster than summer lightning. Desert Rose was holding her Winchester again. Shutters closed, doors locked, and parents hurried their children inside, leaving the street as empty as a church on Saturday night. Sheriff Randall stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, torn between duty and common sense. "Miss Mitchell." "Catherine, as the law in this town, I can't just—" "You can and you will, Sheriff," Kate cut him off, her voice carrying the kind of authority Randall's badge had always aspired to but never quite achieved. "This started before your time, and it'll end the same way. Some things the law can't touch." Wade Bishop had backed out onto the street, his left-handed draw position perfect, gun still trained on Kate. His brothers flanked him, their own weapons now drawn, but their hands were shaking. They'd heard the stories of Desert Rose all their lives, everyone had, but seeing the legend come to life before their eyes was something else entirely. 8 years, Wade called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. 8 years I've dreamed about this moment, practiced for it, lived for it. Kate stepped out of the saloon, the setting sun casting her shadow long and dark across the packed earth. The Winchester rode naturally in her hands as if the 8 years without it had been the aberration. 8 years is a long time to waste on hate, she replied, her boots raising small puffs of dust as she moved. Could have built something in all those years. Could have become something more than just another man with a gun. With this face? Wade's bitter laugh echoed off the buildings. With these scars? You took my choices away that day in Yuma, left me with nothing but revenge. From the saloon doorway, Clara watched the scene unfold with her heart in her throat. The Catherine she knew, quiet, gentle, always ready with a kind word, seemed to have vanished. In her place stood a stranger who wore familiar features but moved like a hunting cat, each step measured and deadly with purpose. I gave you a choice that day, Kate said, stopping 20 paces from Wade. Could have killed you like I did the others. Instead, I took away your gun hand, gave you a chance to walk a different path. Her eyes were hard as desert stones. Not my fault you chose to walk it left-handed instead of straight. The youngest Bishop brother's gun wavered. Wade, maybe we should— Take one step toward your horse, Wade snarled, and I'll kill you myself. We finish this here, now. The sun touched the horizon, painting the street in shades of blood and gold. A warm wind stirred the dust, carrying with it the memory of 8 years of peace about to end. In windows up and down the street, faces appeared and disappeared like ghosts, the whole town watching while trying to remain unseen. Your brothers don't need to die here, Kate said quietly. This is between you and me. Let them ride out. Like you let my other brothers ride out in Yuma? Wade's pockmarked face twisted. No, they stay. Want them to see the great Desert Rose fall. Want them to tell the story of how Wade Bishop outshot the legend? Kate nodded slowly, as if she'd expected nothing else. Then let's be clear about the rules. No shooting from the sides. She looked at the brothers. You draw on me, you die first. This is your brother's fight. Let him have it clean. The redhead swallowed hard. Luke, maybe she's right. Do as she says, Wade ordered, his left hand rocked steady on his gun. Desert Rose wants a proper duel, we'll give her one. One last taste of the old ways before I send her to hell. Clara's voice carried from the doorway, thick with unshed tears. Catherine, please. This isn't you anymore, you don't have to do this. Sorry, Clara, Kate replied without turning. Sometimes a person has to be who they really are, not who they're pretending to be. Her voice softened slightly. Go inside now. Check on your mother. Remember me as I was. Not as what's about to happen. The sun slipped lower, the shadows growing longer, stretched like truth across the packed earth of the street. The wind had died completely, leaving the air heavy with anticipation. Even the ever-present sound of crickets had gone silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Anytime you're ready, old woman, Wade called out, shifting his weight slightly. Been waiting 8 years for this, don't want to wait another minute. Kate stood perfectly still, the Winchester held low but ready. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the silent street, to every window where worried faces watched, to every heart that beat in fearful anticipation. 8 years ago, she said slowly, I walked away from this life because I was tired of counting the dead. Tired of being the fastest, the deadliest, the most feared. Thought I could bury Desert Rose under years of peaceful living. Her eyes met Wade's across the 20 paces that separated them. But some things don't stay buried. Some debts have to be paid, and some people have to be who they are no matter how hard they try to be something else. The Seth Thomas clock in the saloon began to strike the hour, its chimes rolling out across the silent street like thunder. With each sound, the sun slipped a little lower, the shadows grew a little longer, and two people faced each other across 20 paces of dust and destiny, waiting to see which of them would live to see the stars come out. The last echoes of the clock faded into the dusty air. Kate felt time slow down, the way it always had in moments like this. Every detail became crystal clear. The creak of leather as Wade shifted his weight, the soft whisper of wind through the empty street, the gleam of dying sunlight on gun barrels. 8 years melted away like morning frost, and the habits of a lifetime came flooding back. 20 paces, a distance she'd measured 1,000 times with her eyes, with her feet, with her life, the exact length where skill separated the living from the dead. Wade's gun was already drawn, his left-handed grip steady as stone. Kate's Winchester remained low but ready, patient as death itself. Been studying you, Wade said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. All these years, every story, every witness account. They say you never shot first, always waited for the other man to make his move. His pockmarked face twisted into a smile that never reached his eyes. That true? Or just another legend? Not legend, Kate replied quietly. Just good sense. Person who shoots first is committed, can't change their mind, can't adjust. Person who shoots second knows exactly what they have to beat. The youngest Bishop brother shifted nervously. Wade, if she's really never lost, shut up! Wade's voice cracked like a whip. She's just an old woman now, whatever she used to be. Time catches up with everyone. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a shadow of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Kate watched it all with the calm detachment that had made her legend, her mind cataloging every detail. The way Wade's weight was distributed, favoring his left side slightly. The angle of his gun, a fraction too high for optimal recoil control. The tension in his brothers' faces as they watched their sibling prepare to face death. You want to know the truth about Yuma? Kate asked, her voice carrying the weight of long-buried memory. Why I left you alive that day? Don't matter now. Wade's gun hand tightened imperceptibly, but his voice wavered slightly. It matters, Kate continued as if Wade hadn't spoken. You were different from the others even then. I could see it. You weren't empty inside like your brothers. You were angry, yes, lost certainly. But there was still something human in your eyes when that guard died. Something that flinched. Trying to get in my head, Wade snarled, but his voice wavered slightly. Trying to shake my nerve. I'm trying to give you one last chance, Kate corrected. Same as I did that day. Walk away, Wade. Take your brothers and ride out. Let the past stay buried where it belongs. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered in Wade's eyes. Something that might have been doubt or recognition or even a glimmer of the boy he'd been before violence and vengeance had marked him inside and out. But then it was gone, replaced by the hard glitter of 8 years of hate. Too late for chances, Wade said softly. Too late for walking away. Raise that rifle, old woman. Let's see if the legend lives up to the stories. Clara's voice carried from the saloon doorway where she stood despite Kate's warning. Please, both of you. This doesn't have to happen. But Kate knew it did, had known it from the moment she recognized Wade's face, from the instant she'd seen that familiar mix of pain and purpose in the gunman's eyes. Some stories could only end one way, written in powder and lead across the pages of history. Her hands remained steady on the Winchester, but her senses had sharpened to a razor's edge. She could feel the smooth wood of the stock against her cheek, the familiar checkering on the grip that Martin Chen had carved by hand, could smell gun oil and leather, desert dust, and the metallic tang of approaching night. Could see the subtle tells in Wade's stance that telegraphed his intentions as clearly as signal flags on a battlefield. They say you were magic with that Winchester, Wade continued, his voice taking on a dreamlike quality. Say you could read a man's mind, know when he was going to shoot before he knew himself. That true, or just more legend? No magic, Kate replied. Just experience. Person about to shoot has to shift their weight first, has to commit their body before their finger ever moves toward the trigger. Telegraph their intentions clear as sunrise to anyone who knows how to read the signs. And you can read them? Always could. Kate's eyes never left Wade's face. It's why I'm still alive. Why all those fast young guns who came looking for my reputation ended up in Boot Hill instead. Body tells the truth, even when the mouth is lying. The sun touched the western horizon, painting the street in shades of amber and shadow. Soon it would be too dark for this dance of death, but both knew it wouldn't last that long. One way or another, their 8-year journey was about to end. Wade's brothers had backed away slightly, their own guns lowered, awareness finally dawning that they were watching something beyond their understanding. This wasn't just a gunfight. It was history unfolding, legend coming to life, the past reaching out with steel fingers to claim its due. Last chance, Kate said softly, her voice carrying the weight of every life she'd ever taken, every death she'd dealt in the name of justice or vengeance or simple survival. Walk away. Be more than just another bullet in another grave. The wind had died completely now, leaving the air heavy with anticipation. The whole street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when memory became murder, when legend became lead, when 8 years of peace finally shattered under the weight of a single trigger pull. Wade's face hardened, his decision written in the steel of his eyes and the set of his jaw. Shoot, he whispered, and the word carried all the force of a death sentence. Shoot and die, Desert Rose. Time seemed to crystallize, each second stretching like molasses in winter. Kate watched Wade's face with the concentration of a lifetime, reading the minute changes in expression, the subtle shifts of muscle that preceded action. 8 years of peace dissolved like morning mist, replaced by the cold clarity that had once made her legend. Faster than thought, the old-timers used to say about Desert Rose's shooting. Faster than a rattler's strike. But it had never been about raw speed. It was about reading the signs, about seeing the future written in a person's eyes before their hand ever moved toward their gun. Wade's left hand was rock steady, his gun already drawn and aimed. To the casual observer, he had every advantage. Weapon out, target acquired, trigger a mere hair's breadth from death. But Kate saw what others missed, the slight tension in his shoulder that would slow his reaction time, the way his weight was shifted just a fraction too far forward, limiting his ability to adjust his aim. "Any last words, old woman?" Wade's voice carried across the 20 paces of dust and destiny that separated them. "Any final wisdom before I send you to meet all those men you killed?" "Just a question," Kate replied, the Winchester still held low but ready. "That guard in Yuma, Samuel Turner, do you remember his face, or has it faded like all the others?" A flicker of something, pain, guilt, memory, crossed Wade's pockmarked features. "Trying to shake my nerve won't work. I've waited too long for this." "Not trying to shake anything," Kate said softly. "Just wondering if you ever think about the choices that brought us here. About all the moments you could have turned aside, could have chosen a different path." Sarah's voice came from the saloon doorway, thick with fear. "Catherine, please." "Stay inside, Clara," she called back, never taking her eyes off Wade. "This won't take long." 8 years, Wade said, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. 8 years of practice, of planning, of dreaming about this moment, about proving that Desert Rose was just a person after all, just flesh and blood and bone that Lead could tear through like anyone else. "Flesh and blood," Kate agreed. "Never claimed to be anything else. Just a woman who learned to read the signs, to see the moment before it happened, to know when death was coming and step aside just fast enough to let it pass." The sun hung on the horizon like a drop of blood about to fall. Long shadows stretched across the street, turning the dust to liquid gold. In windows up and down the street, faces appeared and disappeared like ghosts, unable to look away from the history unfolding before them. Sheriff Randall stood helplessly by, his new badge suddenly feeling like lead on his chest. This was beyond law, beyond order, beyond anything his authority could touch. This was legend coming to life, the past reaching out with steel fingers to claim its due. "They say you can see it coming," Wade continued, his left hand steady on his gun. "Say you can read a person's intentions before they know them themselves. That true? Or just another story to scare young guns away?" Kate didn't answer immediately. Her eyes had taken on a distant look, as if seeing beyond the present moment into some realm where past and future merged. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every shot she'd ever fired, every life she'd ever taken. "Want to know the truth about speed?" she asked quietly. "It's not in the hands, not in muscle or bone or sinew. It's in the mind, in the ability to see the moment before it happens, to be moving before the other person knows they're going to shoot." "Philosophy won't save you," Wade snarled, but there was a tremor in his voice now. "Not against 8 years of practice, not against a hand that's never known anything but hate and revenge." "Hate makes you fast," Kate acknowledged, "but it also makes you blind, makes you miss the small things that mean the difference between living and dying." Her eyes locked onto Wade's. "Like the way your weight is shifted too far forward. Like the tension in your shoulder that'll slow your trigger pull by a fraction of a second." Wade's face paled slightly, his gun hand twitching almost imperceptibly. "You're trying to—" "Not trying anything," Kate cut him off. "Just telling you what I see, what 8 years of peace have taught me about watching, about waiting, about seeing the truth beneath the surface." The wind had died completely now, leaving the air heavy with anticipation. Even the dust seemed to hang motionless, suspended in the last rays of sunlight like memories frozen in amber. "Shoot," Wade whispered, the word carrying all the force of 8 years of obsession. "Shoot, or I'll kill you where you stand." Kate's voice was soft as falling snow, hard as desert stone. "No, son, you won't, because I can see it in your eyes. The same thing I saw in Yuma, the hesitation, the doubt, the human being still alive beneath all that hate and pain." A muscle twitched in Wade's pockmarked face. "You don't know anything about—" "I know everything about you," Kate interrupted, "because I've been you. Been that angry young soul with a gun and a grudge, thinking speed and hate were enough to make a life worth living." Her hands remained perfectly steady on the Winchester. "But I learned better. Learned that the fastest shot isn't worth a damn if it's not backed by something more than revenge." The sun slipped lower, the shadows growing longer, stretched like truth across the packed earth of the street. In that fading light, two people faced each other across 20 paces of dust and destiny, while history held its breath and legend prepared to become reality once again. The tension in the street grew taut like a bowstring drawn to breaking point. In that infinite space between heartbeats, Kate saw everything with crystal clarity. The tremor in Wade's gun hand that betrayed his uncertainty, the way his brothers had backed away from the impending violence, the last rays of sunlight painting the street in shades of blood and gold. "You think you know me?" Wade's voice cracked like dry timber. "Think you can read my soul like you read gun hands?" "I know the weight you carry," Kate replied softly. "The faces that haunt your dreams, Samuel Turner, Martin Chen, all the others who died because you chose the wrong path." Her eyes never left Wade's face. "Know it because I carried that same weight until I learned there was another way." "There is no other way," Wade's voice broke. "Not anymore, not after 8 years." "There's always another way," Kate said. "Right up until the moment you pull that trigger. Right up until you make the choice that can't be unmade." Clara's voice carried from the saloon doorway, thick with tears. "Wade, please listen to her. It's not too late." The crack of Wade's gun cut through her words like thunder, but Kate had seen it coming, had read it in the subtle shift of weight, in the tightening of shoulder muscles, in the desperate need to silence the truth before it could take root. She was moving before the bullet left the barrel, her body flowing like water around the path of lead. The shot echoed off the buildings, sending pigeons scattering into the darkening sky. A splinter of wood exploded from the wall behind where Kate had been standing a heartbeat before, but the former bounty hunter had already shifted, her movement so smooth it seemed almost casual, as if death itself couldn't touch her. "Fast," Kate acknowledged, her voice unchanged. "But anger made you shoot wide, made you pull the trigger before you were ready." Wade's face had gone pale, his left hand adjusting his aim with desperate speed. "That's impossible. Nobody's that fast." "Not about speed," Kate replied. "Told you that already. It's about reading the signs, about seeing the moment before it happens." Her Winchester remained steady but still not raised. "Want me to tell you what's going to happen next?" The youngest Bishop brother's voice shook. "Wade, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Wade's gun swung between his brother and Kate, the movement jerky with tension. "Nobody's leaving, nobody's backing down. This ends here." Kate nodded slowly. "Yes, it does. Want to know how? You're going to shoot again. 3 shots this time, fast but not fast enough. Your hand's already getting tired from holding that gun so long, and the doubt's creeping in. After those shots miss, you'll start to realize what everyone else figured out years ago. Speed isn't everything." "Stop talking!" Wade fired again, the shot going wide as Kate seemed to flow around it like smoke in the wind. 2 more shots followed immediately, the bullets throwing dust from the street where the former bounty hunter had been a fraction of a second before. "Just like I said," Kate continued, her voice still calm, still measured. 3 shots, all missing because anger and fear are riding your hand. Want to know what happens next? Wade's gun hand was trembling now, his face sheened with sweat despite the cooling air. "You're not human, can't be human." "Human as they come," Kate replied. "Just old enough to have learned that most gunfights are won or lost before the first shot's fired. Won or lost in the mind, in the heart, in the ability to see truth instead of what you want to believe." The red-headed brother had backed all the way to the hitching post, his own gun forgotten at his side. The youngest had gone pale as paper, watching legend come to life before his eyes. Sheriff Randall stood frozen, his hand nowhere near his gun, understanding that he was witnessing something beyond his authority to control. "Next," Kate continued as if discussing the weather, "you're going to realize that your left hand's starting to cramp. 8 years of practice are good, but muscles don't lie. The tension's building in your shoulder, making your aim less certain, making you wonder if everything you've believed about this moment was wrong." "Stop it!" Wade fired again, the shot wild, desperate. "Stop talking and shoot. Fight me like a woman." "Like a woman?" Kate's voice carried a hint of sadness. "What kind of woman spends 8 years feeding her hate instead of healing her wounds? What kind of woman lets one moment of violence poison her whole life? The sun hung on the horizon like a dying ember, painting long shadows across the street. In those shadows, two people faced each other across 20 paces of dust and destiny, one desperate and afraid despite his drawn gun, the other calm and still, despite the bullets that seemed unable to touch her. "You want to know what happens last?" Kate asked softly. "Want to know how this story ends?" Wade's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, hate and fear, doubt and desperation. "Just shoot, please, give me the fight I've waited for." "No," Kate's voice was firm but gentle, "because this isn't about fighting, never was. This is about choosing, about seeing the moment when you can finally let go of the past and walk a different path." The weight of 8 years seemed to press down on the street like a physical thing. In windows up and down the boardwalk, faces watched in silent witness as legend and reality merged in the dying light of day. "Last chance," Kate said quietly. "Walk away. Be more than just another bullet in another grave. Be the person you could have been if hate hadn't stolen your choices." The street had grown silent as a grave, the only sound the ragged breathing of Wade Bishop as he struggled with the weight of truth and memory. His left hand trembled on his gun, the tremor growing more pronounced with each passing second. 6 shots fired, 6 shots missed, and Desert Rose hadn't even raised her Winchester. "You're playing with me," Wade snarled, but fear had replaced certainty in his voice. "Dancing around like some kind of devil." "No devil," Kate replied calmly. "Just a woman who's learned to read the signs." She could see it in his eyes now, the crumbling of 8 years of hate, the weight of truth finally breaking through walls of denial. His gun hand shook violently and tears cut tracks through the dust on his pockmarked face. "I see them," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Every night in my dreams. Samuel Turner, Martin Chen, all of them. Thought if I killed you, they'd finally leave me alone." "They never leave you alone," Kate replied softly. "Not really. Best you can do is learn to live with them, learn from them. Let their memories guide you toward something better than what you were." Slowly, like ice breaking up in spring, Wade's gun hand began to lower. The barrel dipped toward the ground, wavered there a moment, then dropped completely. The sound of the gun hitting the dirt seemed to echo off every building, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. As the first stars appeared in the deepening purple sky, Kate lowered her Winchester and walked toward the man kneeling in the dust of Copper Gulch. 8 years of hate had drained away, leaving behind only the scared young man she'd seen in Yuma, finally ready to choose a different path. "What happens now?" Wade asked, his voice rough with spent emotion. "Same thing that happens after any mistake," Kate replied, offering her hand. "You start over. One day at a time, one choice at a time, starting with standing up."